I am heavy weapons guy. And this is my weapon.
I'm not going to sit here and prelude to you in a pointless, overwritten prologue about how the TF2 shorts are obviously very good and very funny, and that they're the funniest shorts ever written and animated, needlessly analyzing every single detail. That would be a pointless endeavor and a very boring intro that I very smartly decided to scrap when I realized how boring it was. All you have to do is watch the shorts yourself and just be in awe of Valve's art direction and character writing. That is far more worthwhile than any of my Google Doc ramblings could only hope to attempt to illustrate to you. What is currently fascinating me with TF2's animated shorts, and by further extension, its cast of characters, is how they, and TF2's style and vibe as a whole, have been able to resonate with people so much more than the actual games themselves. I don't believe it's far-fetched to say the Meet the Team videos are the main reason for TF2's massive popularity. One of the best feats of video game advertising ever put onto the internet. You see the funny sandwich man? You get to play as that guy and eat said funny sandwich in-game. What makes TF2 a unique case, and the positive or negative ramifications it would have for the industry, is it's the first case of a video game advertising itself with its characters on such full display like this, despite the game at launch having no story whatsoever. Not to say character has never been the forefront of video game advertising. Think back to the character mascots of the 90s. Bright, colorful, simplistic character designs made with the limitations of their respective consoles in mind. Now, I love these characters, but they were primarily designed as mascots. And I don't mean that in a cynical way, that their only artistic value was their ability to sell units. These characters are great in spite of the conditions that they were made under. They're mascots in the way that they can be fundamentally redesigned or repurposed to fit the needs of the artists and the publishers, regardless of the fact that they might have some actual narrative potential. These characters were the pioneers of their respective genre, and much like TF2, they would set the standard for the designs that would later come. But what is so unique about TF2, and the character-based shooter design that it ignited, is that its characters are written like the parody of the genre, despite it being the progenitor of what we would later come to call the hero shooter. I think you could totally convince anyone unfamiliar with video games that a game like TF2 came out after a game like Overwatch, that it's the parody version of it. But Overwatch was the game that came out after TF2. That game is the one that tries to have its characters be taken seriously, trying to showcase and design its personalities with a very cynical mass market appeal in mind. And TF2 came out the cage fucking swinging by actually being funny. A counter to the way hero shooters and character-based games like that try to write their characters now. Not implying TF2 is lowbrow, but it's kind of funny to look back at the history and how backwards it kind of feels. I don't know if this exists for like any other genre. It's like if Fallout 1 came before D&D, and sci-fi was the true origin of the genre, and high fantasy was what replaced it. I think TF2's careful balance between earnesty and irreverence is why TF2 has had such a grip on internet culture. Far after the height of its relevancy, Gmod and Source Filmmaker videos, while obvious parodies, feel oddly true to TF2's nature in a way that the dirty Newgrounds cartoons of mascot platformers simply don't. Distinct voice lines, designs, and personalities to match said designs in order to provide greater player distinction in the heat of battle. And when taken out of that ecosystem, the characters now have to present themselves in front of the camera. Liberties needed to be made to their character in order for them to fit properly. Heavy may come off as a big dumb screaming idiot in game, but in this interview, he's actually a stoic calculating man who enjoys the art of battle in a strangely thoughtful and romantic way. And I don't just mean because of the thing with his gun.
Oh my god, who touched Sasha?
These characters are open to a surprisingly massive amount of reinterpretation, able to be bent and changed to fit the comedic needs of the story. Like the Warner Brothers cartoons that TF2 is similar to, the charm comes from the very scenarios these characters are put in, and what animated personalities they're forced to be paired with. One character may get the victory over the other, but in the next episode, they're the butt of the joke. They're able to be dropped in any setting and have the jokes basically write themselves, whether that be parody or official content. And the want from the community to see them fulfill that narrative potential that they have, I think is why these characters have remained relevant for as long as they have, even when the game itself wanes in popularity. So, here's the problem. Valve has these amazing character designs and personalities on their hands. Designs that grew far past their original intent of just being distinct character designs for a shooter. These characters lend themselves to such massive narrative potential, but due to the limits of the game being a multiplayer shooter, there's only so much story you can shove in a player's face without the narrative coming off as obtrusive or a nuisance. And with Valve quickly drafting the elements that would later emerge into TF2's lore, an outlet for the game's storytelling was soon needed. So, the majority of TF2's story had to reside elsewhere outside of the main game. And What was the format that was chosen? A TV show, of course. No, wait, that got canceled. We'll just upload the 15-minute pilot to YouTube and pretend it's an advertisement for an update. No one will ever know. So, the TF2 Adult Swim show was in development and got canceled by Valve after the first episode of production. And the show was actually canceled years after TF2 had already begun telling its story without the need for animation. So, what medium did they choose? Comics! At this point in a Batman comic, your hero would be kneeling in an alley crying over some dead opera lovers. Not here. With Team Fortress Comics, you'll get only the highest quality white-knuckle prose. Then we'll smash it like a fiery zeppelin into action-gorged drawings of me holding Yetis I killed with my bare hands, while I plummet out of planes that I also just killed with my bare hands. Get ready for the most monumental event in comics history, an ongoing series starring me plummeting to my death. And also the mercenaries who work for me, not currently plummeting to their deaths, but just you wait. Oh shit. That was my Saxon Hale impression, and that really fucking hurt. Comics were the medium chosen to tell TF2's story, and I think that's the most interesting choice Valve has ever made when it comes to their storytelling. Keep in mind, TF2 came out in the era where everything looked like this, and webcomics were very popular, so having digital comics shipping with the updates was a very savvy way of connecting the story with the online player base. The Meet the Team videos and animated shorts can't really be expected to come out on a constant basis, but comics can be made much quicker, and can come out at a more consistent time frame. They can match the very quick speed that TF2 was evolving at. And while the Meet the Team videos are the most popular thing to come out of TF2, and maybe a better way to showcase the personalities of the characters from the game to general audiences, especially for marketing purposes, the comics were the best way to tell the game's story. And damn, what a good story they told. What a faithful adaptation of these characters. And I'm sure many TF2 YouTubers with a huge influence who act and claim like they really understand TF2 would also understand this too, right?
The TF2 community has completely forgotten what the Mercs' real personalities are. Soldier is not incapable of rational thought, Medic is not some charming and clever German doctor, and don't even get me started on Pyro. That's just an objective fact. If you compare to how the mercenaries were treated on the game's launch and for the first couple of years to the final chapters of the TF2 comic, these are not the same characters. They're not the same personalities. They have been completely twisted and warped into something that is completely unlike what their characters were supposed to be at launch. It's not even hot, that's just true. Like, what else needs to be said? And of course, the most obvious and clear example that Richter Overtime made a very, very fun video about on his second channel is where he's talking about the Pyro, and I got that stupid spat on Twitter where like, yeah, Pyro's character went from this mysterious, creepy, bug-like man that burns people to death and chops off people's heads with a fire axe to a literal puppy. A puppy dog that begs for table scraps at the end of the final comic. Like, that is a complete and total Flanderization of the character by writers who had no idea what the mercenaries were supposed to be at the game's launch, right? They were hired on, brought on, long after TF2 was made and released and launched, and then when they were given the green light to do whatever the fuck they wanted with the story that was never meant to ship with the game in the first place, and didn't ship with the game in the first place, and the game did not have for the first couple of years since the game's launch, then everything went to shit and the characters just became something else. And if you like the comics, that's fine. I'm not, you can go and love these things. You can go and love the past 15 years of fan canons and what have you. I'm not dogging that. Go write your fucking, I don't know, Sniper X Spy, you know, lovers fan fictions. You go crazy. I don't care. But none of that should be applied onto the game itself. None of these things apply to the true game, nor should they be projected onto the game. These things exist wholly removed from the actual game's canon. Simple as that.
So here's the thesis I want to lay out for you all. That includes you too, Mark. I think that despite the popularity the comics have been gaining over the years, I don't think the wider TF2 player base, and those who are generally familiar with TF2, understand just how important the comics are to TF2 history, what purpose their narrative served, and ultimately, why the comics matter. People seem to treat the comics as this offshoot side story that isn't important to your understanding of Team Fortress history, but what a lot of those people fail to realize is how integral the TF2 comics have been to the formation of the game, how they tied into its updates, tone, style, and how said ideas finally found their way into the main game and broader TF2. You don't have to engage with the comics. They're not there to impede your enjoyment of the main game or anything. They are, like the Meet the Team videos, supplementary material. But it seems that certain people don't understand the purpose of the comics, their writing, and how they helped shape what TF2 would become with its updates. This is a story that's been years in the making, tying along with the game's ARGs, events, map designs, weapons, and the game's approach to multiplayer storytelling. The update pages would be full of little Easter eggs or story details that would later be expanded upon, rewarding attentive readers by either being addressed in the comics or in the game. Every part of TF2's sphere existed in this symbiosis. They were all there to support the game. You can choose to completely ignore the comics, the ARGs, and the story as a whole, if you'd like, but if you're a fan of TF2, if you're a fan of Valve in general, you're doing yourself a huge disservice by ignoring these comics and missing what makes Valve's storytelling so great. Why the comics are some of the best video game adaptations to date. It's hard for people to take video game characters and the bizarre abstractions and nature of games and translate them into other mediums, mainly film or TV, usually because most games aren't really concerned with narrative in the way other art forms are, trying to take a very abstract concept and then somehow try and put a moving story onto that, or because they take characters that are initially charming just based on their simple designs, who do have some narrative potential if given to a competent enough team, but are then twisted to meet the expected tropes and writing qualities oversaturating movies and TV, or maybe because the games, even story-based ones, work so much more effectively as games. This is common with most video game adaptations, even in ones that people act like are good but are still bad, and it's amazing to see what a team of good writers can really do with these characters given the opportunity. I do need to state this before moving forward. Adaptations are not perfect one-to-one reflections of the source material. They're not supposed to be. They don't really have to be, nor should anyone expect them to be. That applies to any medium. Take, well, TF2 for example. The initial artwork had more muted, desaturated, grayer colors with a more heavily detailed and rendered look to them. These simply wouldn't work in game because the game needs to cut down on visual noise. So they did, narrowing the designs down just right until they looked like this. The style has now been reified. This is not TF2's art style. This is TF2's art style. These works are conceptual. They are not accurate principles of which the game is supposed to abide by, or 100% exactly look like. TF2's concept art didn't end up looking one-to-one like a Rockwell painting, for example, nor did TF2's final look and style end up being exactly like its concept art. Changes, whether they be big or small, must occur in order to allow for that successful translation. And like any translation, these characters are not exactly one-to-one with these characters. This does not mean that these are fundamentally different characters, it just means that there is a distinction between the way the characters were written in the game and the comics. The way said personalities act is presented in a different manner in order to adapt to the writing style of a comic. And people point out this discrepancy as a flaw in the character writing, but that's not what's going on at all. If you observe the way characters act and speak in-game, it's largely quippy one-liners and blunt mannerisms, a sort of overly pantomimed way of talking, because it's in service of the gameplay, where people be shooting and dying and shit. So characters are loud and kind of obnoxious in order to deliver that information in a crucial and effective manner. Spy is suave and collected, and has a demeanor much more sophisticated than the mercs around him, but if you listen to him in game, most of what you'll hear from him is,
"I'm looking at your x-ray, and I'm afraid you suck!"
So, I think anyone couldn't make an argument that this spy is not accurate to this spy, no matter how minute the differences may be. I wouldn't agree with something like that at all, but that's basically the argument a lot of the comic detractors make. In the Meet the Team videos, you get to observe what this character is actually like as an NPC, and in a dialogue-heavy medium like a comic, that part of his personality is given greater emphasis. Is this a flaw of the comics because he's not going,
"I am going to fillet you like a salmon"?
No, it's just how writing for comics is. It wasn't a flaw in the Meet the Team videos either. This is also referenced literally in the first Meet the Team video, where the heavy stoic demeanor in the interview is directly contrasted to his mannerisms in-game. The whole shtick of the Meet the Team videos is that you get a look at what these characters are like outside of the moment-to-moment. They're mock interviews, that's the joke. And it's true, these characters weren't intended to be fully fleshed out and have full backstories. They were initially archetypes for gameplay purposes. But if you wanted to write them as full characters, I think this is a very faithful way to do it, since they were written by, you know, the writers at Valve. And keep in mind, the Meet the Team videos themselves did this too. Before Meet the Medic, Medic's personality wasn't shown that much in-game, so the Meet the Team video gave his personality a facelift, establishing him more as a careless, demented mad scientist type who views his patients as experiments rather than actual people. Give his voice actor Robin Atkin Downes a more defined performance and direction, and then boom! Now we have the Medic that we all know and love. It's okay for characters' original intentions to be retconned if it's in service of a better story, and when taking said characters and adapting them into a story, you have to write them in accordance. And I love you Meet the Team videos, but actually just looking at the character writing, I'm gonna say that I think the comics are better. The main series of the comics follow Miss Pauling and the Mercs after the events of Man vs. Machine. Greyman, the secret third brother of Redman and Blutarch, has successfully captured Manco from Saxon Hale in his attempt to retrieve the last bit of Australium on Earth, a mysterious element with the ability to extend one's life. After losing their jobs, Miss Pauling receives a message from the administrator to find the Mercs and get the team back together, and retrieve the last bits of Australium. The series begins with Miss Pauling's journey to assemble each Merc, seeing what their lives have been like after the war, getting a greater insight into their characters and motivations. The initial purpose of the comics was to provide context for the in-game conflict, delivering a story where the moment-to-moment gameplay was just simply unable to. Over time, the comics grew into a fully fledged narrative that started more and more directly crossing over into the main games, providing interesting twists on nameless concepts that had no intended form. The first major lore comic reveals that the announcer voice is actually controlling both sides of the conflict, mediating the fight so that both teams are locked in an eternal stalemate, and that they never find out that they're being played. As the updates came, and the story continued, the comics gave greater backstory into the major players in this game. Every time a major lore comic is released, it's furthering the narrative in a way that, even when events are told out of order, are thematically relevant, pushing towards the events of Man vs. Machine, the end of the Gravel Wars, and the events of the main comic series set after the game. The term lore is probably the wrong word to use here. It's more backstory than anything else. You could read TF2 lore on a wiki page on some nerd shit, but that's not the intended way for this story to be experienced at all. Every bit of lore that has ever been added has just been the next chapter in the game's narrative. And I'm very glad TF2 never fell into the lore trap like how Fallout did. The worst thing Bethesda ever did was give any attention to the inane ramblings of Chris Avellone. It helps that this isn't an adaptation that's given to another studio. These comics are written and illustrated by the people at Valve. A clear understanding of these characters is already present, and the new opportunities presented by the settings these comics take place in. They put the characters in scenarios that only add more to what started out as simple, but very well performed and written archetypes. Another benefit is that I don't think you need to have actually played TF2 to enjoy the narrative here, although knowledge of the game and its history does enhance the experience. I think like most people who've seen the animated shorts, they enjoyed them because of the characters on display, not because they understood a reference from the game. More than anything, it also helps that the comics, and the written word itself, are very funny, such as the narration occasionally dished out by characters like Saxon Hale or Marasmus. I tend to find myself glossing over most narration when reading, like most American comics. I would be doing a big favor to myself by reading actual books, but the little details and jokes hidden in the writing makes it very rewarding to pay attention to. A natural extension of the TF2 blog posts and how they were written. Seriously, of all the things gone from TF2 no longer getting major updates, the blog posts are actually one of the things I miss the most. Lead writers Jay Pinkerton and Eric Walpole have a very firm understanding of what makes these characters appealing, why these simple archetypes have a lot of hidden depth to them, writing dialogue that's appropriate to each character, the scenario and mood at hand, never feeling obnoxious or phoned in and sappy. It's all pretty consistently what you'd expect from the writers at Valve, and most importantly of all, is funny. You're likely familiar with both Eric and Jay from their work on Portal 2. Eric in particular writing for a lot of Valve titles. Personally speaking, I'm not actually the biggest fan of Portal 2's core sense of humor, but I do think it can be quite funny. And at its core, it's a pretty prescient and really biting satirical romp that's become quite poignant over the years. An obnoxious idiot who thinks he's smart and begins fucking everything up to a comical degree. Sounds goofy, but it's real.
It's real, son.
I've always been consistently impressed with the work these two have done in the comics, and I feel their writing style actually serves TF2 better than it did in Portal or Half-Life, especially Eric's work on the Meet the Team videos, most of which he wrote himself. But from what I've been able to gather, the comics really seem to be Jay Pinkerton's babies. Of course they were co-written, but Jay Pinkerton's writing style is on full display in the comics, and he's often the one answering most emails and fan questions about the story. And if you played the game, you're already familiar with his writing and sense of humor. Him and Chet Falasek wrote much of the endgame dialogue and item descriptions. A very dry and witty sense of humor with dialogue and writing that becomes more absurd the more you read into it. Maybe, too absurd at some points. Seeing the mercs outside of the context we usually see them, which is bloody murder, is a very odd sort of boundary break type feeling that the Meet the Team videos already did pretty well. But the comics go even further, leaving where the Meet the Team videos left off. I do enjoy the mock interview style of the first batch of Meet the Team videos, but I find the skit-based approach of Meet the Spy and Meet the Medic to be far more effective at showcasing these mercs, as I find they perform so much better when paired with the other personalities, but keeping said merc as the center or focus and star of the show. And simply put, they're just funnier than the other Meet the Team videos. The writing of the comics, the character dynamics, and the scenarios bringing the mercs together, I think really attracts much of the artists and animators who have been working with these characters, playing into expectations of character dynamics that the player base already picked up on. The antagonism between Sniper and Spy is so perfect and befitting of their characters. Sniper and Spy don't really have much interaction in the comics or animations prior to this point, but their roles in the game are very antagonistic, and it's something the community picked up on. Spy and Sniper are rivals. It was never said anywhere, but it's so fitting for both their characters and their endgame classes. The fact that these two can just barely stand each other makes for some of the best comedy in this series. And Spy's monologue towards Sniper about wearing his jacket is my absolute favorite piece of dialogue in the entirety of the comics. And the manner in which these characters are illustrated only better helps to punctuate that humor. Lead artist Heather Campbell has a style that melds perfectly with the writer's sense of humor. You're probably most familiar with her game mode illustrations for Quick Play, prior to being replaced by Casual. Another reason as to why Casual is the worst thing to happen to TF2. Being a fan of Valve herself, her illustrations carry over Valve and TF2's sense of humor perfectly to comic format. A goofy yet poignant style that fits right alongside TF2's established influences and themes, while embellishing her own charms into the whole thing. You can just look at any panel she's done and then tell it was done by her, giving a lot of attention to characters' facial expressions and poses that fit the wacky slapstick nature of TF2's physical and verbal quality, but knows when to reel the characters back in, providing some really dramatic artwork when the time calls for it. She really does have a wonderful style. It's not an exact translation of TF2's look, but the look itself is uniquely Team Fortress. Marin Marmola's cover art is also fantastic. Each cover a parody of various well-known comics, drawn in the style of the 20th century works that inspire TF2's look. The comics also have an additional edge over other comics due to the fact that they are webcomics, and the panels use the reader's ability to mouse click to great advantage, having panels change on the next click for comedic effect, or slowly having each panel appear to punctuate the drama and build towards dramatic reveals. That interactivity gives them a unique reading experience that a physical comic with everything laid out just can't, and it never overstays its welcome or is used as a crutch. It's a very integral part of the reading experience. You ever read Captain Underpants and the Flipperama shit? It's great, dude. It's kind of like that. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. I'm a 22-year-old man, baby. Fuck you. The drama itself is surprisingly well written. There was never a moment where I felt like the comic took itself too seriously, or that I felt was cringy in any way. It always knows when to bounce back to the usual lightheartedness, never expecting or forcing you to take what would otherwise be something really silly as something to be taken seriously. Instead, it's blunt about what goofy ideas are up front. Much of what makes the comic so important to TF2 is how much they've influenced the history and direction the game would take in its post-launch state, the fuel for the creative ideas that would be added, providing context to the otherwise contextualist world these insane mercenaries habit, in a manner that is very appropriate to the setting, the art, and its influences. Things were implied in TF2's original state, but never concrete. TF2 was an open canvas ready for more additions to be made, and how the comics and story contextualized this endgame conflict was brilliant. TF2's art direction was purposefully absurd, slightly surrealist. As graphics advanced, the oddly symmetrical maps and the absurdly asymmetrical maps the battles took place in needed a style to match their architectural oddities. A more realistic style simply wouldn't match or look good. No longer are the maps of TFC and Quake Fortress just an asset flip, they have their own style and look to them now, matching the nonsensical architecture in an era where graphics are rapidly advancing. The maps of the game now contextualized around two companies at war, Red and Blue. Everything fits into that 60s spy aesthetic, that mid-20th century bombastic Americana. So when the TF2 team got around to expanding the story they wanted to tell, one big question remained. What type of people would build their rival companies in fortresses right next to each other? Two twin brothers, Redman and Blutarch, forced to split the land inherited by their father, Zephaniah Man, a land that is completely, utterly barren. Gravel is what they're fighting for, and gravel is what they're convinced will generate them more wealth and power. They've been raging this war against each other since 1850, and in the 100 years that's passed, both brothers were completely oblivious to the world that progressed around them, spending fortunes hiring hundreds of thousands of mercenaries over the years to spill blood over the gravel fields, expanding their lifespans with a life-extending machine powered by a mysterious element known as Australium. These men are rich, stupidly rich and powerful, and all of their unearned hereditary wealth is wasted on pointless family rivalry. And quite a family history they share. Each member of the Man family, whether they be friends or blood related, are all motivated by greed, stupidity, or simple bloodlust. The lore of TF2 has a unique history and character to it. The family drama that serves as the background of the story only undermines how pathetic the whole conflict is, teetering perfectly between wacky family antics and surprising tragedy. Gray Man, the secret Third Man brother, is fantastic as the chosen antagonist for the series. The humor of the comics often comes from the pairing of characters much smarter than those they're forced to interact with, trying to reason with or understand them to very little avail. Gray Man in particular, unable to wrap his head around how he's being undermined left and right by those around him, being subjected to the ridiculous nature of the TF2 mercs and this entire world. Gray Man has sat by and watched as his brothers have wasted their time and their father's wealth fighting over a barren wasteland. He himself finally ends the war by killing both his brothers and seizing control of Manco, their father Zephaniah's munition company that is now in control by the Hale lineage, the only thing in the Badlands actually worth fighting for. He's got a wonderfully diminutive and egotistical design that looks even funnier when they decide to beat the shit out of him. Saxton Hale, the CEO of Manco, is by far my favorite character to come from the comics, and a fan favorite for a good reason. He's the perfect distillation of TF2's absurdity and satire, an absurdly rich macho Australian man, his dangerous and cartoonish escapades, fueled by the wealth he generates from the millions of mercenaries willing to buy his weaponry. And it's the weapons he produces that are what our team of mercs fight with, each new weapon more wacky and inefficient than the last. He's a stupid man, but he has that billionaire charm that leads to great humor between the people who are much smarter than him. Many of the monologues and rants Saxton has are among some of the funniest writing in the comics. TF2 has always had this off-the-rails nature to its writing and comedy, and Saxton is the living embodiment of that, an absolute joy of a character, and a perfect face for this once nameless company. Every bit of context the comics provide to TF2 never takes away from its setting. They always add to the world, making the setting bigger and adding more mystique to the conflict at hand, and always focused on one thing, the thing TF2 nails the most: character. This is all perfectly executed in the character of the Administrator, Helen, if that even is her real name, and it's likely not. What was once the faceless, nameless voice of a brooding, cackling old woman narrating the stakes of your game is this evil mastermind in charge of orchestrating this war, viewing this conflict as nothing more than a game she can bend to her will. Every merc just pawns on a chessboard. And considering how TF2 is often compared to a game of chess, that's a pretty fitting depiction of what was just a voice with no face or identity. Her design is excellent, maybe the best character design of the comics. Artist Heather Campbell, the art director of the TF2 comics, originally came up with a mock design of this character in 2008. The design was so good that it eventually landed her a job at Valve, and her design became the canon look. She has a cold, embittered, and calculating appearance to her, a posh and devious quality to her hair and outfit, always a cigarette in hand. You can tell that at one point in her life, she was quite beautiful, but the time, money, and meticulous planning over decades and decades have corrupted this woman, finding joy and humor in anything that creates malice. She cares very little for people or the need to understand them, and is completely driven by her one goal. The entire narrative of TF2's story was the lingering question of why she orchestrated this war, why she's kept it going for so long, and why she refuses to let it die. The comics have always been excellent at showcasing what the mercs are actually like as people, and what they get up to outside of battle, and the circumstances of Manco's capture, and the Gravel Wars ending after the death of the Man brothers ends up throwing the mercs back into the real world, so to speak. And the real world of TF2 is just as fucked up. The world of TF2 is cynical, and the people who inhabit it are cruel, but the comics are never too mean-spirited. Every character moment the mercs get fits the plot, always furthering the momentum of the story, even when set plot points are purely played for comedy. They always add to that underlying heart that is carried throughout the entirety of the comics. One of my favorite examples of this is the introduction of Sniper's parents. The reveal of Sniper not actually being born in Australia, but the lost land of New Zealand, is one of the best bits of comedy in the comics. And his parody Superman story about his parents sending him to the surface not only is a great parody and homage to the medium, but also plays into the pulpy absurdity of TF2 and its influences. New Zealand itself in the TF2 universe being a land which sunk itself into the ocean on purpose. You know, this is very much that type of reality. Sniper's whole character, despite being somewhat of a loner who the other mercs view as kind of a freak, secretly seeks some form of approval, mainly from his parents, two outback country bumpkins who aren't approving of his line of work, and who died shortly after the Gravel Wars ended. When he comes face to face with his real parents, seeking the approval from them, he quickly finds out both are completely incompetent and couldn't give less of a damn about his return. His parents are key to retrieving the last bits of Australium, only for them to ruin everything in a very funny and very Team Fortress way. And those comedic moments, working in tandem with the plot, are what end up getting the mercs captured and continuing the events of the comics. When he meets his adoptive parents in heaven, finally giving him that approval he's always wanted, Sniper is filled with a newfound sense of purpose, closing his arc in a very heartwarming way as he quickly goes rogue after his resurrection. Heavy's mom and sisters take this family dynamic to the best possible place you could. Hinted at previously in multiple comics, we now actually get to meet the family he's been providing for. And I think it was the perfect way to ground Heavy's character again, and really show what actually motivates this guy to do what he does, and why he even enjoys this line of work. Heavy, underneath his loud demeanor in game, is actually a very stoic intellectual, who is often viewed by others as just dumb due to his appearance and mannerisms. His quiet, brooding side is juxtaposed with his loud cries and amusement in battle. It's the joke of his character. But more often than not, Heavy's character is taken literally by many as just a big dumb fat guy who likes shooting his gun. And I get that things like Gmod videos are of course going to purposely give a distorted version of these characters, but in game, all people are going to see is him screaming and shouting funny voice lines and performing goofy taunts. And when you feed the community a constant feed of updates where you dress this big guy in stupid outfits and give him a haha funny sandwich where he goes nom 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 nom, it's like, okay, we're definitely losing the plot a little bit here. The comics put his stoicism and intelligence at the forefront of his character, and in a medium where dialogue is very important, we get a lot out of Heavy's character here. More often than not, the voice of logic in the team, picking up on things everyone else just doesn't notice. He's not emotionless, far from it, and that boisterous side of Heavy we all know and love will peek its head back out at certain key moments, but his cold, practical demeanor provides the needed counters to the jokers he gets paired up with, as well as delivering much of the heartfelt moments and drama that punctuate certain moments of the comics. It's also funny that the only other real look into Heavy's character, other than the comics and the Meet the Team video, is the fucking poker game of all things. Heavy's entire arc is motivated by a need to protect the ones he loves, and whatever perceived evil he deems needing of defeat. Heavy isn't materialistic, but he has many people and things in his life that he cherishes, including his gun. Underneath his cold exterior is a family guy. His relationship to his sisters and his mom, the need to protect them and provide for them, adds that needed tension and wholesomeness appropriate to his character in this story. He isn't the main character in the comics, but his presence is used at some of the most impactful moments in the story, fitting for the character who is well known for being the poster boy of TF2. The comics also return to much of the friendship set up by the comics and the games themselves. We get more of Soldier and Demo's friendship and banter, and a really great delve into Heavy and Medic's bromance. One of the more notable and inspired additions is the character of Heavy's sister, Jana. She's a complete counter to a character like Miss Pauling, a strong, fierce, brooding woman, much like her brother, that conflicts with Pauling's petite neuroticism, and the weird little sub-conflict they have throughout the comics is charming, and ends in a very funny way. Her main contribution to the story is serving as Soldier's love interest, and I assure you she is a lot more than that sounds. Growing up most of her life hidden in Siberia, she has a complete misunderstanding of how the world works. She's not stupid, she's shown to be quite capable and resourceful, but there's a childlike wonderment and naivety underneath her, and when that naivety of hers meets Soldier's fantastical, completely delusional view of the world, she falls head over heels for him. That and the fact that he's the first man she's ever had sex with. Love is truly beautiful. Their antics serve as one of the main comedic workforces for the story going forward, and as time goes on, they genuinely form a very strong romantic connection that's quite sweet and quite loving, and very, just look at him. I also find Hale's old love interest, Maggie, to be a pretty underrated character too. She's not given a ton of page time, but every place she's put in is always in service of furthering Saxton's character, and getting him to the point where he stops being a selfish idiot. And that's what's great about characters like Maggie and Jana. They always act as a counter or a support to another character, highlighting the former character's flaws. Then there's of course the relationship between Spy and Scout, something the writers had been building up and experimenting with over the many years in updates. Spy and Scout are complete opposites. They're a fantastic pairing, and adding this hidden family drama underneath it all only benefits the characters and the story they're wanting to tell with them. First, a joke about Spy banging Scout's mom later evolved into a mystery of, hey, what if this guy was actually the father? It's a retcon on what was just a simple joke, but one that's in service of providing greater character interaction and drama. So for Expiration Date to be about a guy getting dating advice from a man he doesn't even know is his father is pretty wholesome, all things considered. Man, this is the second time I've said wholesome in this video. Maybe I could say it 100 times? The writers have never been subtle about this truth in the comics, often played as a joke on Scout's complete denial and inability to understand or accept this fact. Spy is incredibly harsh on Scout, for good reasons, but often manages to bring out that softer side of Spy when we pull on that family history, that iconography. In Spy's monologue to Scout, when he believes he's about to die, is one of the very few instances where Spy drops his holier-than-thou superior attitude, albeit through one of his disguises. It's pretty heartwarming. It's not really that sad, or much of a tearjerker by any means, especially since the following scene undercuts it with Scout dicking around in heaven, purposefully so, but it's a great play into Spy's character that gets followed up on in the ending. It's great to see the treatment Heavy and the rest of the mercs get, how they are utilized in surprisingly dramatic ways. The dialogue can be pretty gripping and potent depending on who's speaking. You're so used to these characters cracking jokes and one-liners and bantering and blowing each other up. Underneath the goofy and exaggerated exterior of TF2's world is a pretty biting and cruel satire, much like The Simpsons. And when that comedic veil is lifted, the events at hand are pretty bleak.
Much like The Simpsons.
The comics, often being written and paired alongside the updates, pay so much to the history of TF2, like having Marasmus be Soldier's ex-roommate. Considering that the writers have stated that the Halloween updates are of dubious canon, it's good to see that a character like Marasmus wasn't just thrown out. TF2 as a whole, with the exception of the microtransaction puke fest it later became down the line, has actually been very good at balancing its Warner Brothers goofiness with its 60s spy edge, both in its core art style, weapons, and updates. The comics, in my opinion, have actually been better at balancing the wackiest with the drama, since it's 1, an actual story that can afford to have drama, and 2, there's no option for people to pay $15 in microtransactions to dress the illustrations up in stupid in-game gaudy cosmetics, and when they really lean into that history, and I mean like really lean into that history, playing with it in a way that, when they bring something unexpected back, it's genuinely transformative. Like when they brought back, of all things, the Team Fortress Classic mercs. It's not just a callback that plays into Valve's history, though it is a good callback nonetheless, they actually become an integral part of the story moving forward. Compared to the TF2 mercs, they're an actual unit, who've spent the last few months hunting down the Administrator's best mercenary teams. Yet for all their high-tech gear and prowess, it's the group of wacky Warner Brothers characters that ends up coming out on top. And that contrast between the two teams, both visually and character-wise, leads to some pretty great exchanges. TFC Heavy is this impatient, loud, boisterous, and demanding man who loves to monologue and go on, often butting heads with Medic, who is now under his employment, who he then ends up killing right in front of the TF2 Heavy. Of the villains in the comics, he's by far the most unlikable, and in a good way. Seeing Heavy beat the shit out of this guy is just pure catharsis, and our big man Misha over here, unlike the TFC Heavy, actually respects his Medic. The TF2 mercs are characterized as a team of incompetent rejects of the mercenary world who, by wacky cartoon antics and genuine heart underneath, manage to rise against all odds. They're put in plenty of scenarios where they're genuinely tested, but when they end up victorious, it feels earned, and always in service of the comedy and the characters. And their baffling nature, the hijinks they often unintentionally bring along with them, end up getting the best of their enemies, who are completely unprepared to deal with the buffoonery they cannot be expected to deal with. But out of all of the characters the comics have introduced, the absolute best to come from them, and the point of view of which the comic story hinges on, is the Administrator's assistant and the mercenary's supervisor, Miss Pauling. Miss Pauling is the anchor of the TF2 comics, carrying TF2's nature and the mercenaries along the journey, along TF2's entire journey. Originally starting out as just a simple background character in the comics and lore, as the story continued and the world expanded, Miss Pauling slowly started gaining importance in the comics, until she finally became a staple of Team Fortress canon, serving as what we could call as the closest thing to a main character in this ensemble cast. There's no way you can make any of the mercs the main character of the story. They're mercenaries for hire, often disliking one another despite being part of the same team, just like actual TF2 players. They're too self-interested as characters to lead the charge in a way that Miss Pauling could. Much of her role in the comics, matching up with her job as a supervisor and the administrator's assistant, is serving as the mediator between much of the conflicts of the story, often following her point of view as she tries to keep the ongoing conflict stable, balancing all of these parameters that no other sane person could keep together. You'd expect her to be played completely straight, given that she is their supervisor, and in many instances she does play the straight man, but she balances out the characters by only just barely having it together. Buried underneath is a complete neurosis that manifests under very strange conditions, which, when paired with these guys, happens quite often and makes for good comedy. The dynamic she has with every merc in the comics is just so charming. She can command characters like Soldier and Pyro with ease, but when paired with someone like Heavy, she's pretty out of her league. It's hilarious to try to see her reason and deal with a character like Scout, but it's wonderful to see how much respect she has for characters like Heavy and Engie. Despite technically being their boss, she seeks a lot of guidance from these guys. They've been through a lot, and while Pauling is performing quite well for a young administrative assistant, under the most bizarre circumstances known to man, she's only barely keeping herself together, and that slips out often during these stressful points in the comics, and while mostly played for laughs, can actually make for some good drama. Spy and Pauling is a pairing often seen in the comics, and it's one of my personal favorites, and his role as a sort of mentor to her throughout the comics is a pretty cute dynamic. Spy is more capable than Pauling just as an individual, but doesn't really have the same drive that she does. A pessimist to his core that makes him completely unaware that he can just sometimes be an asshole. And sometimes that pessimism of his can actually cut Miss Pauling pretty deep. And when his incessant complaining actually makes Miss Pauling cry, his reeling back to comfort Miss Pauling, albeit done in a slightly comedic and very Team Fortress way, is genuinely heartwarming. Despite the mercs most often hating everyone and everything, a real friendship between her and the mercs is apparent, and it's really sweet to see these grizzled, hardened mercenaries take a genuine liking to Miss Pauling, and it's great to see how much the wider TF2 community have taken to Miss Pauling as a character, now that her presence is more well known and more incorporated into wider TF2 knowledge. The writers always had a hard time adapting the lore in the comics into the actual main game. TF2 is a multiplayer game. Story isn't the main focus, so it's obvious as to why most of the story was relegated to Easter eggs and comics. So Miss Pauling serves as that bridge. By now having Miss Pauling be incorporated in the very famous TF2 animations, and having her be the framing for TF2's contract mechanics, is the most natural way to do that. And so you put this cute girl front and center? Well, suddenly the gamers of TF2 want to know who she is and where she's from and why she's here, and boom! Now you're reading the TF2 comics. And she doesn't even want anything to do with you because she's a lesbian. Although you'll still probably be into that. Miss Pauling is no Mary Sue either. Most of her days are spent doing horrible menial labor and tasks for the administrator, not even getting a single day of vacation during her entire tenure. I mean, this woman gets really fucking beat down, with her story ending with no real catharsis. And I really enjoy this slightly neurotic secretary archetype being subjected to the worst working conditions of all time, but successfully managing to triumph through the efforts of her and her team. Makes the victory feel earned. The mercs are devoted to Miss Pauling, but not the administrator, who are very much aware is up to no good. Her complete and utter devotion to the administrator, her belief that all of this hard work will end up paying off in some grand master plan, ends up becoming a really tragic plot point when none of it comes true. Even if it's good that whatever she had planned never happened. She's such a fitting part of TF2's style and image. A great example of how TF2 really started to come into form after its launch. I don't think that, in the grand scheme of things, she's the most integral piece of TF2. The mercs will always be the stars of the show, but Miss Pauling adds so much to TF2's identity that it would be upsetting if Miss Pauling never existed. I mean, I would be upset if these comics never existed. What she is integral to, however, is the story they've been telling since 2009, and having the main comic series be Miss Pauling's little adventure with the mercs gives the comics the unique identity they need. She's not overused or overrepresented. This is still an ensemble cast, and every character is given their appropriate time and appearances, but it's so apparent how TF2's story just wouldn't work without Miss Pauling. When all of the wacky antics end, it all narrows back down to Miss Pauling, who's ready to lead the charge. I can't overstate how incredibly well written Miss Pauling is as a character, the most dynamically written of all of TF2's cast, and a great representative of TF2 and its personality. I do have criticism of the comics, of course. Some big, some small, but nothing that majorly impedes my enjoyment of the story. And I think most comic fans are on the same page when it comes to their flaws. For as great as the comics are, and as worthy of a read as I will continue to preach, the way the story was told was not the most well handled in retrospect. Oh, the story itself is great, but the journey to actually completing that story was a little rough. These comics were made under Valve. And I find myself exhausted at the prospect of trying to make another joke about how Valve never gets things done on time. The first 5 issues of the main story came out on a timely enough manner, released every 3 or 4 months or so. This is decently quick, all things considered, but issue 6 took 2 years to come out. Understandable, since the comic was almost double the length of the previous, and waiting a couple of years for a comic is not the most outrageous thing, but like all that Valve does, it came without any warning as to why it took so long. I'm actually fine with the wait. In retrospect, I think the quality of the artwork shows when compared to the previous issues, but I wish we had gotten a proper explanation. It also retroactively kind of makes me wish the previous issues had the same kind of attention, because you can kind of tell they needed it. The scope of the story and comics becoming way more ambitious than they had probably expected. It was hard to recommend the comics to people when we didn't even know if the final comic was actually going to happen. I had given up all hope until the lead writer announced its existence on a Twitter post, of all things. A very Valve move on his part, and that final comic came out 8 years later. 8 years. I mean, better late than never, and from what the writers and artists have said, this thing almost might not have ever happened. And I thank them immensely for actually getting together to finish it, but wow. 8 years? Another issue I haven't really heard people address, and the severity of this issue may depend on who you are, is the read order of the comics. If you go to the website, the comics are separated as TF Comics and Update Comics, which would probably lead many to believe that these are all just bonus materials that can be skipped over. But that's not the case. Many of these issues are lore-important comics that initially set up the events that the main story covers. The team tried to remedy this with the catch-up comic, meant to get people up to speed. But you would be so much better actually reading the comics that formally introduce the characters and concepts the catch-up comic tries to condense. Condensed in a admittedly easy to understand manner, but you're kind of depriving yourself of a good story by doing this, because these issues were originally written as follow-ups to those comics. So if you read the catch-up comic first that introduces you to Gray Man only through text, and then meet him for the first time in issue 1, you're missing his great introduction and banter with his brothers in his first actual comic appearance. And because these important issues are lumped together with the other comics that are actually just simple update comics, a new reader won't actually know which ones are actually worthwhile. It is much better to get the full context and history that leads into the main comics. Even with how integral these comics are to the history of TF2, how they tie into much of the ARGs and mysteries, they're negatively affected by some of the retconning that happened to TF2's story. It's not massive, but retconning did take place as the story was developed. It's not the comics' fault, it was the collective TF2 team all deciding and changing the direction they wanted to take the series. The comics were just written around it. The main 7-issue series itself was all planned out since the first issue. The script for Comic 7 had actually been done for years, they just never had the artwork finished. That's why it took so long to release. But everything leading up to the main issues was certainly not decided yet, leaving behind the most lingering mystery, that people are still confused by, the Mann family portrait. Although never outright stated by the developers, everyone knows at this point that the character in the middle was supposed to be Gray Man, back when they were still planning out who the mysterious third brother was and teasing his existence. But when they finally came up with his actual character and backstory, this character's identity was retconned to be, well, they have never actually revealed who this character is supposed to be. They even reference this mystery in the final issue. This doesn't, like, destroy the narrative or anything like that. As I've stated, I'm completely fine with retcons. Canonicity is a dumb thing to become attached to, as sticking so close to it prevents you from making changes or additions that could benefit a story, and that is exactly what they did with Gray Man. And this illustration was made before most of the lore was actually planned out. But if you were following TF2's story from that moment all the way until now, you'll be a little disappointed that they never came up with an answer for that mystery. Oh, Silas Mann. Who is he? What's his relationship to Zephaniah? Who is this dude? Just give us the answer. I know it exists. Even simple printing issues have been mistaken for retconning, leading to mass ramifications for how people perceive the lore going forward. In the original release of the catch-up comic, Elizabeth in this panel was accidentally referred to as Emily, leading people to believe that these were all 3 different women that were all just descendants of each other and not just the administrator living through different periods of time. They actually do reference this error in the final comic, which is a nice wink, but I remember butting heads with people who thought these 2 versions of the administrator were 2 different people. You know, not nowhere near as delusional as the people who think clone theory is real. Jesus. There's also the fact that, while I think some detractors of the comics blow it out of proportion, it can get a little goofy for some people's taste. I think it's always funny, but it's open for debate on how appropriate it can be. I said that I like Sniper's parody's Superman backstory, and I still stand by that, but there is an argument to be made that it does deviate a bit from TF2's established tone, even if the joke itself is referenced as being very unbelievable and absurd. Even with something like the giant bread monster or Pyroland, and how goofier the TF2 animations did get as they went along, I have trouble rationalizing how this would fit with the other examples, like if this was animated and voice acted. I mean, TF2 has always been pulpy and cartoony and very Warner Brothers with its style and character designs, and I do think you can make Sniper's backstory work to be more on par with the 3D animations. When they finally introduced Saxton Hale in 3D, it was perfect, but I feel that it's worth pointing out that it does get pretty comical. But it's also worth remembering that Valve's development on TF2 became goofier as it went along as well, before the comics had any major presence or even existed. The first comic was made to advertise the Jarate weapon, a jar of pee, which you throw at your enemies, in-game. Not to mention the random XD sandwich jokes they made with Heavy because it was 2008 and once again everything looked like this. And you had characters like Pyro doing Hadoukens and Heavy blasting finger guns. There's already tons of videos out there going over the absurdity and cartoony functionality of TF2's weapon designs. I do understand that there is a line. Not everything in TF2 is supposed to be intrinsically funny, but I find the criticism of the TF2 comics being too goofy to be a little unsubstantiated. When you just look at actual TF2 and what that game was doing, even at launch. And I do think this is like the goofiest the comics get. The final comic actually really grounding the universe again. TF2 has always been tonally similar to something like Venture Brothers to me, and seeing as they actually did a lot of crossover with Adult Swim, and were, need I remind you, supposed to have a show on Adult Swim, I think my comparison is pretty apt. The comics are flat cartoons, the style lends itself to goofier antics and visuals, even with the heavier emphasis on drama, and I'm sure if these comics were animated, tonally speaking, it would be more in line with the Meet the Team videos, and feel a little more on par with what we typically expect. How certain gags become literalized may be to your disliking as well. If you don't like the idea of Spy being Scout's dad because you thought the simple joke of him fucking Scout's mom was just a funny gag and should have stayed as such, I don't entirely disagree with you, but if you're then gonna tell me that this entire arc was actually handled terribly, I definitely think you're reaching. It's handled very well. There's also just the fact that you may not like comics. You may not like reading a story in this format. In a webcomic format too, I may add, which isn't the most comfortable on a phone or a computer when compared to having an actual book in your hand, even if they make great use of the fact that it is a webcomic. It would be really cool if we ever got physical copies of the TF comics, like how we got a physical release of the soundtrack, but you'd have to make a lot of changes to the format and how the jokes are told, given that these were made with the idea of mouse clicking and changing panels in mind. I mean, you could do it, but it wouldn't be the ideal way to experience these comics. It's also pretty apparent, just as like a fan of TF2 and its characters, that the writers have some pretty clear favorites, mainly Scout and Spy, who are by far the most prominent. Even the expiration date pilot is centered around these two, and I get it, they have a very funny dynamic that can be written to be very heartwarming if done right, and both characters pair with Miss Pauling nicely, but it's easy to see how the comics just narrowly avoid becoming the Spy and Scout comedy hour. Demo Man doesn't get a huge amount of screen time compared to the other mercs either, doesn't have much of an arc other than stop being fat and get a job. He's mostly relegated to comedic relief. It's never obnoxious, it's quite funny, and the scenes where he's paired up with Miss Pauling and Medic are two of my favorites, but more often than not, his presence in the comics is kind of a joke. Oh, and if you like Pyro, forget it. He is almost completely unimportant to the comics, and the only character that I think was written poorly. Well, poorly written is a stretch, because there is basically no writing here on display. Pyro has always been a hard character to write, a strong character design first and foremost with no real personality ever considered for it, no defined mood or mannerisms. He was the last merc to get a Meet the Team video, and all of the dialogue is done by the other mercs, and because of the Meet the Team video introducing the idea of Pyroland, and both Valve playing with the inherent juxtaposition of his design, looking creepy or cute depending on what angle he's in, the goofier aspects of his character started to overtake him more as updates went on, and the community became more involved. And since the comics are a flat cartoon compared to a more rendered 3D cartoon made with heavy dramatic lighting in mind, the flatter illustrative way Pyro was drawn only further tried to puppify him. And that's also maybe because Valve themselves weren't entirely sure of the direction to take this character, and while I still think the Meet the Pyro video is very funny, it only further muddled what little character Pyro even had. And Pyro is my favorite class to play, by the way, and I don't think this is a complete betrayal of Pyro's character or anything, because while I like the implied horror of Pyro's design and how it contrasts with the other mercs, none of this is properly shown in-game. Pyro was a blank slate with no real defined character, and he still has no real defined character, just a walking contradiction, even back in 2007 before the game launched. So as disappointing as it may be to see the writers do so little with Pyro, I think it's better that they mainly left him in the background, rather than forcing him into the story and trying their hardest to make it work. Also, I have to contend this point in Richter Overtime's Pyro video because it is genuinely ridiculous.
There's even a grand reveal retcon in the comics that the TFC Pyro is supposedly actually a woman.
Medic!
Sure doesn't sound like one to me.
This is a stock voice line shared across all classes. That is taking things way too literally, just at complete face value. Wait a minute, I thought the people in Half-Life 1 were actually literal polygon people. What the fuck, Half-Life 2? You can't do this to me. I want the real Barney. I'm also disappointed that we never actually got a comic detailing the Mercs' reaction to the end of the Gravel Wars. All we get is the comic A Fate Worse Than Chess, with Miss Pauling and Saxton prepping the Mercs for the events of Man vs. Machine, but we never get a moment where the Mercs find out the war ends, discovering that both sides were being played, and reconciling with what they were being used for. I mean, not like they even really care that much, it doesn't seem like they do, but I don't know, man, I'd like to see something. And considering that both the comics War and Meet the Director both make a big deal of the Mercs and the Mann brothers never finding out that they are being played, the comics never have a moment addressing this huge part of the story. The only time it's ever kind of acknowledged is with Engineer, who appears very little in the main series. And if you didn't read the 2010 comic Loose Cannon, you may be confused as to why there's very little of him and why he's working directly with the Administrator. Loose Cannon was the first major lore comic that sets up the plot points leading directly into the main series, getting a look into the Mann family and friends, revealing that the Administrator is much older than she lets on to be, working with Engineer's grandfather, Radigan Conager, and bribing him to create a life-extending machine for both Mann brothers. It's here that Engie discovers the existence of the Australium caches, the deeds for the life-extending machines for both Redmen, Blue Tarch, and presumably Elizabeth, leading Engineer to do something, ending up with him working directly with the Administrator herself. This served as one of the big mysteries of the comics, but now that it's over, it's never really been addressed how NG got to that point. It's natural to conclude because at the end of Loose Cannon, NG ended up being the first Merc to find out that Miss Pauling and the Administrator are actually working for both sides. Anyone else who somehow came across this information would have been killed. But due to his family's ties with the Administrator in the Gravel Wars, it's natural that the Administrator would see his intelligence to be of use, and he's the only one capable of fixing and building new life-extending machines. And if you were expecting more Engineer in the comics, he doesn't have a lot of screen time. Purposefully so, and I'm actually okay with how he's used. How his family's experience being employed under one of the Mann brothers as the catalyst for the events of Man vs. Machine, and his ties to the Administrator. In fact, it's strongly hinted at that he's the only mercenary who knows that both sides are being played. His dialogue with the Administrator at the end of Comic 6 is probably the best piece of writing in the comics. That adds a huge layer to his character, but it's never actually commented on in the comics. Also, what's up with Charles Darling? What's his stake? His end goal? He just shows up, demands, and then gets a weird section in the final comic, kind of mocking his existence in a wink-wink meta way. The Darling family is kind of an important part of TF2 lore. Zephaniah's wife was a Darling, and I presume more of Charles' stake in this conflict was going to be explained more in the initial drafts for Comic 7's story, that eventually got cut for making the comic too long and boring, and I'm glad they cut out the parts that were unnecessary and boring, but it leaves this character's arc unresolved. But hey, if you like Charles Darling, at least he had some dialogue in Comic 7, unlike, well, the actual game's characters. In the final comic, we barely heard anything out of half the Mercs. I know that issue 6 is the comic that serves this purpose, Comic 7 being the issue that's supposed to bring the Mann family story to a close, and considering where the plot is headed, the Mercs that they did choose to have lines were appropriate. It's disappointing to see characters like, well, what a surprise, Spy and Scout get endings, but not characters like Medic or Demo. You're telling me we couldn't see what Heavy and his sisters are doing in America? All we get to see is Heavy with a beard. I've seen Heavy with a million beards, man. The characters that actually get proper endings are the comic exclusive characters. And I love those characters, I do think they add a lot, but you're telling me that I get to see Olivia Mann's ending and not see how characters like Engie and Sniper are doing after the war? I'm not saying the comic should have had one kinda cringy scene where the Mercs all band together and deliver speeches about how much they love each other and they love their friendship. But it would have been so much more satisfying if we had several panels briefly showcasing what each Merc is doing after the events of the comics. And then we end on Spy heading to Scout's residence. I also love the artwork done by Heather and the rest of the team too, how much they have provided to the series. But the actual artwork in the comics itself isn't always the most polished. It's a webcomic, these guys don't have a budget, they made these all in their spare time, but sometimes characters will be off model, the line work or coloring may be scratchy or unfinished. It does very much reek of that digital art webcomic look in places. The final comic actually looks worse than the comic that came before it, in certain places at least. It's still all very charming though, the characters have great expression work and weight to their movements, it's just I know that the digital art look isn't going to be to everyone's taste. Especially the first 3 issues of the main series, you get to issue 4 and the difference is pretty immediate. It's not on the level of a professionally done comic, but it's got a style on its own that I know a lot of people enjoy, including me. Comic 6 is definitely the best looking in the series, and I really enjoy how everyone looks in that comic. But if you are looking for an accurate representation of the in-game look and the influences that inspired the comics, that's not exactly what you're getting here. The very early comics, illustrated by Michael Oeming, are more accurately influenced by the mid-20th century artworks and style that influenced TF2. I definitely don't think this would have worked in the long run. Heather Campbell's work is too influential to TF2, and I think her expression work and character art is way more fitting and dynamic. I actually really like how Michael's work looks in the Sacrifice comic, but I don't think a style like this would have worked for an entire series, especially TF2. And a comic is never going to look one-to-one like a 3D cartoon. I'm not expecting the drawings to look full-on like a Charles Gibson illustration, but if the entirety of the series looked as good as Comic 6 does, I really wouldn't have much to complain about. The hardest pill to swallow, for fans of the comics, is that they're clearly playing second fiddle to the animations. Comics were the medium chosen for the story to work around the limitations of working at Valve. Valve couldn't even make more than one episode of a TV show. This was the most appropriate way to deliver TF2's story, given TF2 being an online multiplayer game and working at Valve. But I often think to myself, and imagine, damn, what if all of this was animated and voice acted? Most people still don't even know that TF2 has a story, but everyone knows the TF2 characters in the Meet the Team videos. It's hard to not dream about how much more popular the story would be if these comics were a fully voice acted and animated series. Most of the player base, around the time the comics were coming out consistently, still weren't aware of the story or comics' existence. It's not the center of discussion, and it's a hard sell for people to be invested in comics. And hey, I get it. I'm a visual artist. I don't even really read comics. Why would I want to subject myself to American comic book writing? And it's only like now that the TF2 comics have been almost fully recognized by the community, which is great. I loved the enthusiasm around issue 7's release. But I'll be completely honest, if this entire series was animated just like Expiration Date and the shorts, I don't think anybody would be asking for the reverse. Not implying that comics are inherently an inferior medium. These comics use the format to great effect, but I know the power of TF2's animations. You can see the numbers. And I think a fully animated TF2 series with the writing of the comics would be amazing. And I already love the comics, and that is an unfortunate position for these comics to be in. And I'm not a fan of the weird sort of backlash to the comics, saying they changed the intended vibe of TF2 and its characters, more accurately saying that their characters are just completely different to their in-game counterparts. But when you look at the actual comics, and how long they've been around, you know that's just not the case. I guess if you consider expanding upon a character as a retcon or a rewrite, if you take things that literally, then sure. By those strange arbitrary metrics, I guess you would have a point. I guess that applies to literally every sequel or expansion ever made. And I can guarantee you, if we actually did get a full TF2 TV show, it would have been a lot like the comics. And actually, I have proof of that. It's called Expiration Date, and it's 15 minutes, and you can go on YouTube and watch it right now, for free. People don't realize how insane it is to actually have a finished story from Valve, given their track record. These comics had no right to exist. They're completely free and not in service of any of the profit incentives Valve are usually focused on. They are legitimate passion projects, and I can feel the passion radiating off the final comic entry more than I do anything at Valve currently, more than anything that's come out of TF2 itself post Meet Your Match, and more than anything that will come out of TF2 moving forward. While I'm glad Valve has given us things like the official SDK, and it's cool to see what the modders have been able to cook up now with the resources at their disposal, the actual game of TF2 could not be in a worse state. Well, I mean, we did get rid of the bots, but that's like the bare minimum. We've been really pushing the limits of what's acceptable in TF2. I love how imaginative the community can get, and those with a legitimate understanding of TF2's style and influences can really create something great, but I would never say any of these additions are on par with the standard Valve set, or that this should be the direction TF2 takes moving forward. And the idea of handing over TF2 completely to the community is an idea that makes me shudder and puke and piss and shit like everywhere. I don't want TF2 to become anything like Garry's Mod or Fortnite or Roblox. I don't want future updates having Valve's core TF2 be engulfed by an excess of community content and hats. Actually, let's shorten that. I don't want any more updates in general. I don't want people at Valve to pretend like they care about TF2 anymore, and I don't want the community to pretend that Valve just chucking in more slop into TF2's trough is acceptable. But that's not gonna stop. TF2 generates money, and they will keep adding crap like war paints and holiday cosmetics until the fucking sun engulfs our planet. So, unless we all band together and create the ultimate boycott, Valve are gonna keep TF2 on life support. And I hate to think about how TF2's current state is the result of these shitty business practices. Look, I don't like this video at all. I don't like how it's constructed, how I can barely speak, and how poorly I explain my arguments and thesis. But I stand by the broad idea that TF2 introducing a paid economy with character and weapon customizations and community updates and cosmetics and maps did way more to harm TF2's personality and art than whatever the comics did with Pyro. TF2 is now stuck in this state of life support, trapped in the endless loop of content updates. More hats and maps and game modes bloating the game's once tight visual and mechanical design. TF2, in 2007, was a finished game. TF2, post-Jungle Inferno, in the year 2025, is an unfinished, unbalanced, unoptimized, grossly monetized mess that other developers have rightfully looked at as a message on what not to do when monetizing a game, or going free to play, or dealing with post-launch content. What you should really take from TF2's history is the dangers of live service game design and video game monetization. And hey, I get it, we're all sinners, I've engaged with the system too, I'm a pervert as well. But I don't think that you can make a serious argument that TF2 is better as a free-to-play monetized game, instead of being a normal pay-to-play game where you can unlock all in-game content for free. TF2 could have sat comfortably alongside the other famous multiplayer shooters, many of which are also by Valve, as games that you could just pick up and play and quickly develop your skills. TF2 could have stayed as that beautiful game of FPS chess, even with updates, but it didn't. And I don't think it ever will, despite the game's popularity. I don't know how I feel about TF2 becoming a game where its fanbase is rabidly devoted and unable to move on, yet the game itself is so hostile and off-putting for newcomers. And I think the game's messy update history and monetization has only diluted what TF2 is supposed to be about, especially in regards to its tone and style. People either acting like there's nothing wrong and you should accept everything that's happened, or people co-opting genuine movements about the game's art direction even though they have no idea what they're talking about.
These are not the same characters. They're not the same personalities. They have been completely twisted and warped into something that is completely unlike what their characters were supposed to be at launch. It's not even hot, that's just true. Like, what else needs to be said?
Yeah guys, totally different characters, just completely unrecognizable. What a huge mistake on Valve's part. Valve has never retconned their characters. Valve would never retcon anything in their lives ever. Valve would never make a series about retcons. Valve would never even retcon an entire game out of existence. Couldn't fucking imagine it, man. I don't understand Zesty and why he gets so irate at the slightest things, and why he pretends to have such authority on topics he clearly doesn't know enough about. And I call out Zesty specifically because he presents himself as someone knowledgeable about TF2's art design and wants to have an honest discussion about how it's been impacted, but everything he's learned about TF2's art design has been filtered through like 20 games of Telephone, never showing any actual deeper knowledge about the art history or movements that inspired TF2. Cannot even differentiate between art style and art direction, not understanding the purpose of conceptual works in art, and relevant to this video, his comments about the comics. And anytime I listen to him, as an artist and a fan of the movements that inspired TF2's art direction, I feel like banging my head against a wall. TF2 is one of the first games that got me really thinking about games as art, especially through multiplayer design. Like Halo and the arena shooters that have come before TF2, these games offered legitimacy to multiplayer gaming in a way that the highly corporatized competitive games that would follow TF2 never could. And I don't blame people for having a bone to pick with TF2 for being the game to introduce gacha mechanics into the Western multiplayer sphere, and having TF2's sins infect the rest of the gaming industry. And it's unfortunate the developers burned themselves out on this business model, leaving TF2 in this purgatorial state, never feeling finished or getting a happy ending, and having its curse affect other games in Valve's catalog. And I don't see this issue going away anytime soon. But for as depressing as TF2's current state is, the final release of the comic is the one bit of catharsis TF2 has actually gotten. The last bit of TF2's artistic roots completed. And the comics, unlike the game, are actually finished. For all of my praises and critiques, I think the ending, albeit a bit flawed, in its actual execution, is pretty brilliant, and manages to say so much about TF2's legacy and future in a way that speaks to the fans of TF2 in a manner they needed to hear. The final bits of the comics are melancholy, the most quiet and stark anything in the TF2 world has ever felt, and that sense of unease, alienation from the usual goofy TF2 we expect to see, is how it manages to create such a striking ending. The entirety of the events predating Team Fortress 2 have all been orchestrated by Elizabeth, fueled by her undying hatred of Zephaniah. Zephaniah, despite the ridiculous circumstances, is assured that it will all work out in the end. Zephaniah obviously thought very highly of Elizabeth from the start, handing her his fortune on his deathbed, and the way he talks to her shows he finds a great sense of camaraderie in her. And when he finally hears of her betrayal, straight from Elizabeth, finding out why she has orchestrated all of this, the shock sends him straight to his death. And right then and there, she could have stayed content owning the Man estate and all of its wealth. But that never could have happened. All of the events leading to Zephaniah's death, what would later turn into the Gravel Wars, was all motivated by the pure joy she got from completely undermining Zephaniah. And without him around, Elizabeth has no purpose, no game to orchestrate, and her attempted suicide could have been another potential end. If it wasn't for, once again, the hubris of the Mann family. Greyman. It's Greyman who shows Elizabeth the secret of Australium, acutely aware of who Elizabeth is, and what his father had done to her to motivate this act of revenge. Not that he cares, of course. His family means nothing to him. All he wants is to just take the Australium off of Elizabeth's hands, under the impression that its life-extending properties would mean nothing to her now, considering she finally got what she wanted. But she never actually did. Elizabeth never really knew what she wanted. Her original plan was just to kill the two sons, but she couldn't just do that. That wouldn't be enough. The game of revenge is far too addicting for her to put down and stop playing, even when she won. But now aware of the strange metal she inherited from Zephaniah, Elizabeth has found a new purpose. Like Greyman said, for those with the will to live, it's invaluable. And Elizabeth, now aware of the value of Australium, resurrects Zephaniah to continue her torture. And they've been at it ever since, and so have we. As we cut to the once presumed dead Zephaniah Mann, suspended in air, trapped in a metal sarcophagus being pumped full of his fool's gold. The most macabre visual to ever come out of TF2, a decrepit, barely alive Zephaniah Mann surrounded by the various TF2 maps, watching the entire conflict play out for over a century. And this reveal reframes the entire conflict in an incredibly eerie way, that all of our matches were being broadcasted to Zephaniah, watching his two sons engage in a pointless battle for over a century. That this was all just a game to her. Since the beginning, all of Team Fortress, the countless battles have all been nothing but a pointless game, and a game we played. And in an ironic twist, Greyman himself ended up fulfilling his father's wish of being the true heir of the Mann family, murdering both of his brothers, ending the war, and taking back Manco after it had long been out of control of the actual Mann family. Even since the very beginning, killing the eagle and its babies that captured and raised him after his birth, and being the only Mann brother to have an offspring. Somehow, but because of his father's stupidity, Greyman was cast out in favor of his two idiot brothers, and I wonder, if that never happened, would Elizabeth's revenge even come to fruition? With Greyman there to stop it all? And all of the loyalty and sacrifices Miss Pauling made in order to assist the Administrator were for absolutely nothing. The Administrator had no plan, no place for Miss Pauling. Pauling, like everyone else the Administrator had come across, was just a means to an end. Miss Pauling never mattered, the mercenaries never mattered, all of this was for nothing. And it's that weird feeling of, all of this was for nothing, that has gotten some people confused about the ending, confused about the state of TF2. The writers at one point had a concrete reason for the Administrator's hatred for Zephaniah, but that story just wasn't worth telling. It doesn't really matter exactly how it happened when it all ends like this. So NG tells Miss Pauling just that it didn't really matter. It could be anything. It could be anything you wanted it to be. And that's not a cop-out at all. We do actually, after all of these years, get a reason as to why the Administrator orchestrated the Gravel Wars. We just don't know what exactly ignited that hatred. And keeping that part a mystery, I think helps preserve that mystique and pointlessness. It doesn't matter if you win or lose a match of TF2, it's all just a game. We're there to have fun first and foremost. And yeah, there was some fun to be had in these Mercs' weird adventure. I think the real Team Fortress was the friends we made along the way. Aww. And I think the main message of the comics is a very bittersweet way of telling people to move on. But a lot of people can't handle that. People have taken this in some way as a negative, that being told to move on is detrimental. No, you don't understand. TF2 has to last forever. I have to keep having more updates, more content, more hats. It doesn't matter if Valve wants to move on to other things. There is always more. Yet after all of this, TF2 still stands. It's still popular, people still talk about it. In one of the most striking panels of the comic, we see Demoman standing in front of a photo of one of the many mercs working for TF Industries, the design reminiscent of the hero shooters that would later precede TF2. After the years of hero shooters that followed, that are still following it, TF2 still remains on top. Even if its relevancy wanes, the love people have for it won't follow, after we all finally move on. And that fits the story so well, that these rejects ended up being the ones who would save the world, and the mercs move on as if nothing happened. and their lives become better for it, culminating in the final scene between Spy and Scout, the last lingering thread of TF2's character dynamics. And it's great that, after the Mann family drama, we get back to the Mercs. Afraid of commitment, Spy ran away from Scout and his mother when Scout was very young. Scout never knowing who his father was. Every one of the Mercs knows, and Scout is too stubborn and stupid to realize this truth, and Spy is also too cowardly and stubborn to ever fully admit this to Scout. And he never actually does. Even when he believes Scout is about to die, he comforts Scout by pretending to be his idol Tom Jones, convincing him that he is his father. He talks through to Scout in his disguise, rather than face to face. And in the ending, Spy never tells Scout that he is his father. Scout himself became the father that Spy was never able to be, a father that Spy himself presumably never had either. Like the end of the Gravel Wars and the Administrator's vengeance, the last cycle has been broken. So when he finally takes off his mask, it's Spy finally letting that guilt go. And I enjoy the fact that, although we see his face, we never actually learn his name. And I think that's very fitting, and a very well done ending for this character. It's a brutal recognition of Spy's flaws, that he never really changes his ways, but ultimately uses those ways for good now, finding peace in the fact that his son is a much better person than he is. I still think about this moment, and what this visual says about Spy's character, what the writers were able to do with these simple archetypes over the years that felt true to what was presented on screen. If you told me that this guy joined the war to provide for his mother and 3 sisters, I would honestly believe you, even for other characters when it's really goofy. And that's what's so special about the comics. I'm not a huge comic guy. I'm not a fucking dweeb, alright? I don't pretend to be an expert on the medium, but I am an artist. I love storytelling, and I love Team Fortress. And I thank the people behind the comics for creating such an enthralling narrative around one of my favorite games ever. TF2 itself may never get a happy ending under Valve, but at least the comics do. And that's why the comics matter. Wow, what a fucking video, am I right? I did not expect this video to be this long, but I had a lot to say about the comics. I've never really seen anybody talk about them at length, and I feel like I'm kind of the first person to do so. So if you're watching this and you like the comics, or you've never read the comics, maybe this video gave you a good enough understanding and maybe you'll consider reading them yourself. They're one of my favorite reads, and if you like the comics as much as I do, hopefully I had an interesting enough angle to my approach. To all the TF2 viewers who like my TF2 videos, I once again have to state that I do not advertise myself as like a TF2 channel. I will make a video related to TF2 when the idea hits me. Well, actually, the idea has kind of hit me a little bit as I've been editing this video. Because of how much I've been talking about the art style in this video, I've actually wanted to make a comprehensive guide to TF2's art style. The document out there and the illustrative rendering video are a little hard to understand for people who don't understand the terminology, and so I kind of want to make a video explaining what they meant and the rules that TF2 abides by. But don't expect a TF2 video here, like, in the immediate future. For the long-time viewers, the ones who have stuck around, the next video will be the long-teased and long pushed back platformer video. If you've been paying attention to my videos, I'm sure you'll know what franchise I plan on tackling. I've been teasing it too much. If you thought this video was long, this might be the biggest one yet. Prepare yourselves, unless it actually doesn't come out and I scrap it. And all this buildup that I've been doing since the Minecraft video leads to nothing. Oops. No, I think it'll come out. And if it doesn't, you can kill me. So thank you to the regular fans. Thank you to the TF2 fans. Thank you to all the random fucking disgusting rodent people who came across this video and liked it. I thank you very much. You may catch me playing some TF2 from time to time. I've actually been a little bit more active after a sort of like couple month-long hiatus while working on other things. I still won't be super active, but if you see me in game, feel free to say hi or call me a slur in the chat. It's free country. You can do what you want. Can't tell you what to do. So sit tight. Don't let the bedbugs bite. And good night.